Good morning, dear learners, and once again, welcome to the MOOC on Economics of Gender and Development. And we are towards the end of this course, and we are in week 11, and there are two modules. And in the week 12, there will be four modules. So, this module is on globalization, liberalization, and women's empowerment. So, the intersection of globalization, liberalization, and women's empowerment represents one of the most complex socioeconomic transformations of the modern era. While liberalization seeks to integrate national economies into global market through the removal of trade barriers and deregulation, its impact on women is multifaceted and often contradictory. Globalization is frequently associated with the feminization of employment, the move of women into paid labor, yet it often simultaneously entrenches a motherhood penalty and job precarity within the informal economy. So, this model examines the shifting landscape of female employment, the critical role of universal social protection, and the policy frameworks required to ensure that global economic integration serves as a vehicle for genuine gender equality. So, by analyzing comparative cases from developed and developing nations, it highlights how neoliberal restructuring can either challenge or reproduce patriarchal structures and structural inequalities. Ultimately, the module argues for gender responsive policies that move beyond gender blind efficiency to prioritize sustainable human development. So let us look into the issue of globalization and women's employment. Globalization is frequently associated with the feminization of employment, representing the shift of vast numbers of women from traditional, often invisible work into the paid labor force. So this phenomenon is largely driven by a cost effect where multinational corporations, MNCs, deliberately seek female labor force because it is perceived as more profitable due to lower wages and a perceived higher level of productivity. Employers often regard women as more obedient, less likely to unionize, and better suited to the repetitive tasks found in export oriented sectors such as textiles and electronics. Now, early case studies in countries like Korea, Mauritius, and Bangladesh supported this, showing that export-led industrialization and export processing zones initially improved female labor force participation. However, more recent evidence from South Asia suggests that globalization does not universally promote feminization. In fact, the impact has frequently been negative. So, this is often explained by the technology effect, where economic integration shifts the nature of work toward more skill intensive tasks. Now, owing to persistent gender gaps in technical training and educational attainment, men often become the primary beneficiaries of these new, higher skill roles, while women are displaced from traditional manufacturing sectors. And in India, for example, a trend of defeminization has been observed in the post reform period, with female work participation declining sharply despite robust economic growth. This suggests that market led regimes can polarize opportunities in favor of the highly skilled, leaving illiterate or less privileged women in increasingly vulnerable positions. Furthermore, the informal economy remains the dominant space for women's work globally, particularly in developing regions like sub-Saharan Africa and South. So, women are often absorbed in informal sectors, engaging in small-scale business or subsistence farming, which lack the security and benefits of formal contracts. And in India, approximately 95% of female workers are in informal employment, with a significant portion concentrated in unpaid family labor, the most exploitative segment of the market. Now, even when women enter the formal market, they face a motherhood penalty where the unequal burden of unpaid care. Women globally spend 3 to 2 times more hours of care work than men, restricts their professional choices and advancement. This we have seen in different modules of this course already. And excessive care responsibilities currently keep an estimated 708 million women outside the labor force globally. The impact of trade liberalization also reveals stark regional differences. Which some argue that intensified competition reduces an employer's ability to discriminate. Evidence from the Sub-Saharan Africa region shows that trade openness has actually increased gender inequality in literacy. So, in these agriculture-based economies, women often lack the credit and technology needed to compete in export markets, while the demand for unskilled labor may pull young women out of school early, exacerbating long-term educational gaps. Conversely, in Bangladesh, the growth of the garment sector has significantly increased female labor force participation, though discrimination within the work environment remains high. Finally, informational globalization, the cross border flow of information via the internet and global media, has shown significant potential to mitigate some negative economic impacts. And access to global information can challenge traditional social norms and promote egalitarian views, thereby reducing constraints on women mobility and professional choices. Studies in South Asia indicate this effect is particularly positive for women over 35 years of age who may leverage increased autonomy to access the labor market. So, nevertheless, a persistent digital divide means that rural and marginalized women often remain excluded from these empowering technological spaces. And ultimately, the relationship between globalization and women's employment is a double-edged sword, where the benefits of new opportunities are often countered by job precarity and structural displacement. Now, looking at the supply and demand of social protection and women's empowerment, we see that social protection serves as a fundamental pillar for achieving gender equality and women's empowerment in the world of work. The demand for such system is driven by the unique socioeconomic risk women face, including their overrepresentation in informal employment and the heavy burden of unpaid care work. Globally, women spend 3.2 times, that is more than 3 times, more hours on unpaid care than men. And this disparity that keeps an estimated 708 million women outside the labor force and contributes to a persistent motherhood penalty. This just we have discussed just now. And in the informal economy, women often find a degree of flexibility to balance domestic roles, yet they frequently lack access to health insurance, maternity leave, or contributory pensions. Consequently, there is an acute demand for universal social protection, frameworks that provide rights-based, gender-sensitive measures across the life cycle. The supply of social protection is frequently constrained by limited fiscal spaces, particularly in low and middle income countries where 60% of nations face or at the high risk of debt distress. So, despite these challenges, innovative financing and delivery models have emerged. For instance, India's Mathari boards represent a unique tripartite approach where social protection for informal workers is financed through a legislated levy or cess on production and wages paid by the user of labor. This system ensures financial independence and allows informal workers, including many women, to access benefits like provident fund and medical care. Non-contributory programs such as cash transfers are also vital supply-side interventions. South Africa's Child Support Grant, which is gender neutral in its targeting but predominantly reaches women, has been shown to increase women's individual income and financial independence. Research studies indicate that the child support grant enhances women's decision-making power over financial resources and their active involvement in developmental activities with children, effectively crowding in rather than replacing familial support. Similarly, Brazil's Bolsa Familia program empowers women by designating them as the primary recipients of benefits, thereby addressing intra-household power imbalances. The provision of accessible, affordable, and high-quality childcare is another critical supply-side factor directly correlated with high female labor force participation. In context where state provision is leaking, worker-led initiatives have filled the gap. Examples include the Seva Childcare Cooperatives in India and the Children's Leisure and Learning Center established by UTEP in Argentina, which provide flexible services tailored to the irregular hours of informal workers. Finally, effective governance anchored in transparency, accountability, and participation is essential for building the trust needed to sustain these systems. While digital tools such as mobile apps for tracking contributions in the Philippines and Thailand can enhance accountability, care must be taken to address the digital divide to ensure these services reach the most marginalized women. Now, looking at the issue of making globalization work for women's empowerment, which activities, which measures can help globalization work for women empowerment, we see that to ensure that globalization promotes rather than hinders women's empowerment, a shift from gender blind neoliberalism policy to gender responsive policy framework is needed. International bodies have identified that while economic integration creates opportunities, this must be matched with protective legislation and skill development to prevent the marginalization of women. A primary goal benchmark is the G20 Brisbane goal, which aims to reduce the gender gap in labor force participation by 25% by 2025. A critical mechanism for achieving these goals is the inclusion of labor and gender provisions in preferential trade agreements. These provisions incentivize countries to improve domestic social regulations in exchange for market access. For example, the US CAFTA DR preferential trade agreements included a 142 million capacity building program that targeted women for leadership, resulting in 50 women being elected to union leadership roles and the formulation of 34 new unions. Similarly, Bahrain incorporated non-discrimination at work into national law as a direct result of its preferential trade agreement with the United States. National level case studies further illustrate the impact of targeted policy action. For example, Saudi Arabia's Vision 2030 introduced a suite of initiatives, including the Quora childcare program and legalizing driving for women, which catalyzed a rise in female economic participation from 17% in 2017 to 35.6% in 2021. So it's more than doubled in a gap of 4 years. Similarly, in Australia, the 2024 Working for Women strategy prioritizes economic equality, while Japan has focused on publicly financed vocational training for women. Now, looking at the issue of women in political representation, already we have talked about this in other modules also, and latest evidences suggest that economic gains are linked to political voice, though this correlation is often stronger in industrialized nations than in developing countries. In non-industrialist contexts, the boundary between paid work and household duties is less distinct, potentially weakening the fit between employment rates and the formal political representation. And this we can see in table 1. So in table 1 we see 3 things: women's economic activity as percentage of men and female as percentage of parliament. This we see for the countries like Jamaica, Finland, Sweden, Norway, USA, Canada, South Africa, Namibia, Sri Lanka, Tunisia and Egypt. These data are quite old of 94-95, but let us also see some recent data. So recent data from UN Women, these are available for as on March 2026, indicates that Women constitute 27.5% of parliamentarians globally. This is an increase from 11% in 1995. So for a period of 30 years, this has been more than doubled. And only 7 countries have achieved or surpassed 50% female representation in national legislative bodies, including Rwanda, 64%, and Cuba, 57%. Additionally, 23 countries have over 40% women in parliament, with notable representation in Europe, Africa, and Latin America. Conversely, 21 countries have less than 10% women in parliament, with some having no female representatives. And if progress continues at the current rate, gender parity in national legislature will not be realized until 2063. So almost in 4 decades from now. And in parliamentary seats, women represent 37% in Latin America and the Caribbean, 33% in Europe and Northern America, and 27% in Sub-Saharan Africa. And other regional statistics also show that 24% in Eastern and Southeastern Asia and 21% in Oceania, and lower percentage in Northern Africa and Central Asia. Similarly, regarding local government, data indicates that women hold over 3 million elected positions across 147 counties, making up 36% of local body memberships. So only 2 countries have achieved 50% of female representation at this level, while 29 countries exceeds 40% with varying regional representation levels as of January 2025. So throughout this course, we have frequently cited data relating to women and work. And in most of the occasions, we have noticed gender discrimination in work. Now let us consider some of related data from the UN Women regarding women and workforce. The UN Women data show gender differences in laws impact women across both developing and developed economies. Over 2.7 billion women face legal restrictions, limiting their jobs and choices. In 2023, among 190 economies assessed, over one-third, 69 economies, impose laws that constrain women's employment decisions, and 43 economies lack laws addressing workplace sexual harassment. And globally, women's labor market participation is significantly lower than men's. Since 1990, the gender gap in labor force participation has remained at around 30%, with men's participation at approximately 80% compared to 50% for women. For women aged 25 to 54 age group, the participation rate in 2022 was only 61.4%, while for men it was 90.6%. Additionally, women with children under 6 years face a motherhood penalty, increasing the participation gap of 42.6%. Unemployment rates for women and men were nearly equal in 2022 at 5.7% and 5.8% respectively. However, a more significant jobs gap exists, with women facing a jobs gap rate of 15% compared to 10.5% for men, translating to 1.53 million women with unmet employment needs relative to 150 million men. And women are disproportionately represented in informal and vulnerable employment, making up nearly 60% of global informal employment, with rates exceeding 90% in low and middle income countries. In agriculture, women are overrepresented in seasonal and low-wage work, with limited access to social protection. In 2019, 36% of women were in agri-food systems compared to 38% of men, but this likely excludes self-employed and unpaid workers. Regionally, there are disparities. In Sub-Saharan Africa, 66% of women employment is in agri-food systems. Women farmers typically have less access to land and productive assets than men, with less than 50% of agricultural land holders worldwide being women. So closing gender gaps in agricultural productivity could boost global GDP by approximately 1%. The gender wage gap stands at an estimated 20%, meaning women earn 80% of what men earn. Though this figure underrepresents gaps in developing nations due to informal self-employment prevalence. Additionally, women face a motherhood wage penalty that increases with the number of children. And women encounter more challenges in entrepreneurship, reflecting lower startup rates compared to men and facing greater barriers in sustaining businesses. High entrepreneurship rates among women in lower and middle income countries highlight the connection between entrepreneurship and limited job opportunities. Lastly, workplace violence and harassment affect women of all demographics, with economic costs tied to discrimination and violence against women estimated at 6 trillion US dollar annually. Now let us look in the issue of informational globalization and women. Informational globalization provides in-between spaces for women to build transnational solidarities. In India, digital platforms enables mass action during the Nirbhaya case, where 80,000 suggestions submitted via email forced the Justice Burma Committee to recommend landmark legal amendments. However, closing the digital divide remains crucial, as seen in Google's Internet Sati initiatives. Despite village-level reservations in India occasionally reaching 55%, women's share in the lower house of parliament remained at 11.23% as recently as 2014. However, recent data may slightly different. Finally, addressing pay transparency is paramount. Canada's Equivision platform and the European Union's Pay Transparency Directive represents efforts to standardize corporate reporting on wage gaps. Now, by combining solidarity in financing for care services with binding international trade standards, globalization can be transformed into a sustainable vehicle for genuine gender equality. Now, let us take up certain case studies from developing and developed countries. The impact of globalization on women is mediated by diverse legislative, cultural, and economic context, creating distinct outcomes in developed and developing nations. While global integration often provides new pathways for employment, it frequently reinforces existing social hierarchies or creates new forms of precarity. In developing countries, the transition to market-oriented economies has often been a double-edged sword. In China, neoliberal restructuring led to women bearing approximately 70% of layoffs as state-owned enterprises were privatized. And in India, despite robust economic growth, a trend of defeminization has occurred, with female labor force participation declining sharply, particularly among literate and rural women. And research studies in South Asia suggest that while economic globalization may negatively impact younger women by encouraging them to stay in school, it is mitigated by informational globalization, which empowers women over 35 to challenge restrictive social norms. Conversely, evidence from Sub-Saharan Africa indicates that trade openness has actually increased gender inequality in literacy, as the demand for unskilled labor in agriculture-based economies pulls young women out of education. Further, in developed countries, the challenges are often shifted toward the quality of employment and work-life balance. For example, in Australia, since the 1980s, the deregulation of labor markets has promoted flexible but insecure employment contracts, such as casual and part-time work, which lack essential benefits. Feminist critics argue that the dismantling of the welfare state and the imposition of mutual obligation in social security have penalized women who perform the majority of unpaid caring labor. In globalizing urban centers like Tel Aviv, the occupational structures has thinned out in the middle. Men have disproportionately moved into high status management and tech roles, while women have expanded into lower level service jobs, widening the gender earning gap. The above cases underscored that globalization is not a uniform process. While Saudi Arabia leverages state-led liberalization to integrate women through Vision 2030, Vietnam pursues authoritarian neoliberalism where economic participation is framed as a patriotic duty yet lacks significant progress in civil or democratic rights. So ultimately, comparative analysis of developed and developing countries reveals that without gender responsive legislation, globalization risks reproducing patriarchal structures in both the global north and south. So, with this, let us come to the summary of this module. So, in this module, we have seen that the collective evidence indicates that globalization and liberalization are not inherently gender neutral processes. Rather, they interact with existing patriarchal structures and socio-economic hierarchies to produce diverse outcomes for women. While global economic integration has created new employment opportunities and facilitated the flow of empowerment information, it has led to job precarity, defeminization in certain sectors, and the erosion of social safety nets. The transition into a globalized economy often creates a technology effect that disadvantages women due to persistent educational gaps, while simultaneously leveraging their labor in low-wage informal sectors through a cost effect. To counter these trends, gender-sensitive social protection is vital, providing women with the financial independence and childcare support necessary to navigate both formal and informal labor markets. Moving forward, the success of globalization in empowering women depends on intentional policy interventions. These include the G20's targeted strategies for participation, the inclusion of binding gender clauses in trade agreements, and the strategic use of ICT to build transnational solidarities. As seen in the comparison between developed and developing nations, a one-size-fits-all approach is insufficient or it does not work. Policies must be tailored to address specific cultural, legislative, and regional barriers. And finally, the goal must be to transform the global economy into a space where justice and equality are not sacrificed for efficiency, but are instead recognized as the foundational requirements for sustainable human development. So, with this, we come to the end of this module. And in the next module, which is also be the last module of week 11, as week 11 have two modules, we shall be discussing the issue of women in the global labor market. Thank you.